What is going on, comic fam? It is your boy, the Bearded Comic Bro, and I am joined by Dr. Andrea Letamendi. Thank you so much for jumping on the show with me today.
I'm so excited to chat with you. Thank you so much for thinking of me for your show. It means a
Yeah,
lot.
absolutely. So it's crazy. I've had comic writers and artists and colorists and publishers on my show, but you're my first psychologist that I've had on the show. You're a clinical licensed psychologist. You who loves comic books, and you basically are a psychologist to the superheroes and supervillains, as so often talked about on your podcast. So I'm excited to kind of see, just where this podcast takes us today.
Same. And you would not be alone to say you are that I'm the first psychologist on your show. Sometimes I'm the only psychologist on some of these shows. So
Yeah,
yeah, proud to bring in the psychological science.
I feel like it's a niche. like
It is.
Um, so let's talk about then how I first kind of discovered you. So about 5 months ago on my show, I had Livio Ramandali, who is the writer and artist behind The Kill Lock, and it was one of my favorite books of 2020. And so everyone who watched the show knows that I am a huge fan of that book. And one of the questions I asked him was this kind of idea of the character profiles that were written at the end of each issue of The Kill Lock, and it was you that was doing this. So where did this kind of idea to write these character profiles and put them in a comic book come about, and how did you go through that process with Livio?
Well, honestly, Livio and I knew each other. So we had met, honestly, I think it was Long Beach Comic Con, it might have been. But Livio's an amazing artist. Often, of course, before the pandemic, he would have tables at comic conventions. One of the first times I ever got to know his work and see some of his amazing art, and he's done Transformers. He does Star Wars art. Like he's just truly so talented, and his art has such a style to it like no other. And I remember meeting him at a convention actually, and getting to know him through his work. And interestingly, he also got familiar with my work through my podcast, which is the Arkham Sessions, a podcast all about the psychology of Batman. And we've been friends, and we have always wanted to work together. And early on in the development of his amazing story, The Kill Lock, he said, as he was, and I won't give too much away, but I recommend people check out The Kill Lock. It's a
Yes.
story about these AI characters. Essentially, this is all occurring in another galaxy, in a complete other place, but it is incredible. And these individuals are not human, but they have human psychology to them, and so many things happen to them that they need to, certainly when we first started talking about the development of these characters, he really was interested in how to make them relatable, how to understand them and their psychology through the lens of trauma and hardship, and certainly how to build different personalities. And so as soon as we started to work together, I was like, this is an amazing project. And then he went on to invite me to write up some profiles, which are these psycho biographies. This is what I call them, about the characters you'll find in the story. Their origins, their history, and then kind of their personas, what kind of makes them tick. And since they're robots, it's like kind of cool that we get to almost invent the underpinnings, the psychological underpinnings of these beings.
It's so cool. And what I found so interesting about these profiles is the more I learned about the characters, the more I felt like I could relate to them and I could understand why they did what they were doing in the books, and it just made it a more enjoyable read for me, honestly.
Absolutely. And I think, I won't speak for Livio, but I think he wanted to create these individuals who would have us really question the complexities of our own functioning, our own minds, and our relationships with one another. And he does it through it's such a unique way how like one would think like why would I ever relate to this like piece of machinery, and they're criminals. You know, their backstory is that these are criminals locked together through this mechanism, and their punishment is that they need to sort of kind of like coexist. And there's so much psychology in that. And from the beginning I was thrilled to be a part of it. And that's honestly that's my first project with a major publisher. I've done consultation with writers.
Yeah.
I've been in a couple of writers rooms. Like I've done a little bit of advising and sort of behind the scenes stuff. This is the first time I've been credited and kind of been a part of an amazing project. So for me, it was really such a like really fulfilling part, like a step in
Yeah,
my career.
that's so cool. And I'm like geeking out because I love that book and everything about it. And I sing its praises. I even was tagged in a post today. Someone's like, got a book back. I'm like, oh, I heard of this because Beard likes. I was like, yes, thank you, good. Um, but the more I think like we can, as we can understand people and kind of take the time to listen to where they're coming from, you know, it makes our relations and interactions with people so much better. And so like when we can do that in comics and then take that and do it in the real world, it's so much better when we can just understand where people are coming from, I think. So I was grateful for that in that comic.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, as you say that, one of the things I love to do, because I have, you know, I have a full-time 9 to 5 job as a psychologist at UCLA, and I love that work. But when I get a chance to work with creators and writers and artists, and exactly what you said, the opportunity to use fictional narratives and entertainment media and different types of, you know, in the creative arts, different ways in which we can kind of like engage people around topics of mental health, around topics of trauma and hardship, around topics of recovery and resilience. Like this is what drew me to the field of psychology to begin with. Some people think like, oh, you must have been a psychologist and then like that led you to like check out Batman. No, let me just be clear from day one, my world was Batman. Like I was a fan of Batman the animated series growing up, and it was comic books, it was superheroes. Those were the things that led me to be curious and fascinated about the mind. And this is not an exaggeration. What brought me to the field of psychology, you know, is that world of comic books. And I think, you know, I was speaking about, I'm not allowed to say what this project is, but I was speaking to somebody about a particular Batman graphic novel. And I said, you know, let me say for the record, those of us who read these stories from the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, those of us who read these Batman books, we went on to become psychologists, lawyers, social workers. We went on to become the people that we see in these worlds or that we relate to in our world, right? The people who are helping one another, the people who are trying to understand, the people who are bringing social justice. There's a clear connection for me. And I don't want anyone to doubt that.
Yeah, it's true, and you know, you talk about that in your TED talk that you did, and you talk about that a lot with your podcast, which I found out about because of Levio after our
Oh,
interview
right.
was over. He was sitting back and he saw some of my Batman stuff, and he's like, "You Batman animated series fan?" I'm like, "Yes." He's like, "Tell me you listen to the Arkham sessions." I was like, "No, but what is it?" And the moment he said, he's like, Andrea and Brian, they do this podcast, and you know, obviously transitioning from the Killock to that, and he's like, you got to check it out. So you guys started this podcast what, back in 2014?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that sounds right. We started the podcast actually because I had done an on-camera, I was on an on-camera commentator for a documentary called Necessary Evil, super villains of DC Comics, a really great, I think you can find this on HBO Max. I almost said Plus, I'm sorry. Uh, I get
It,
them
it's
confused.
one of those. It's a Max. It's a Plus. It's a Flick. Who knows?
Okay, so HBO Max, you can probably see it there. And what we realized is that I was there to talk about the psychology of villains, and you had all these amazing folks who Jim Lee and writers, folks like Jeff Loeb, folks who were talking about creating super villains. And I was there to talk about the psychology of super villains, and all of my examples came from the animated series. And so we realized, why not make this into a show, make it into a podcast, and each show would be dedicated to one episode of the animated series. And you know as you know, there's so many shows and podcasts that like review the animated series or kind
Right.
of like talk about it. This was going to be so specific to just talking about the psychology in the episodes, and that would be a part of our responsibility. We would talk about the accuracy of what we saw. We would talk about the real life implications, real life stories of people
Yeah.
who had similar things happen to them compared to the show. And we finished. So we did all the episodes, and we're like, damn, we want to keep doing this show. Like, we can't just stop. So it continues to be called the Arkham Sessions, but we've moved to we covered a show called Doom Patrol, which is much different than the animated
Yes.
series. It's live action, it's modern, it's odd and bizarre. It certainly has so much so many oddities to it. And we completed the first season of that, and then moved to Steven Universe, which was not something we thought we'd do, but we did a poll on our Patreon, and folks really wanted us to cover Steven Universe, so we just started that. And I want to assure people that if they don't watch those shows, but they're interested in psychology in general, there's all sorts of things like between each season, so to speak. We did cover the Christopher Nolan trilogy. We've covered Watchmen. We've covered, other shows and other things in pop culture. We tend to come back home, which is the Batman universe, but certainly I don't want to I don't want to discourage folks from checking it out if it's like, oh, they've never seen the animated series, or they don't think they'll have time to watch it. Yeah, you definitely do not need to watch the source material to connect to the themes.
Yeah, you guys, because you do such a good job too as you review the series that you're looking at. You kind of break down what happens anyways in the episode. So I obviously grew up loving the Batman the Animated Series, watching it through and through. But this, like, I'm like, oh my goodness, yes, I remember this episode. I remember those things, and like, so it works out really well that how you guys present the material and review it and explore just kind of like you said, it's a different aspect of it's not an interview, it's not a review of what you like and don't like about the show. You're like, okay, here are real situations that or animated situation, but we're going to look at these situations and say like, well, why does this character? And I love how you both kind of pull from this idea of we're not going to let other outside influences focus in. We're going to focus in on the episode of what and our knowledge of what we can glean from that, and not from like, well, I remember in this issue he did this or this.
Right, of course, because you can go back to, we have 80 years
Right.
of source material if we were going to do that. And we needed to stay pretty aligned to the stories within, the container of the animated series. And some were, of course, as you know, some of those episodes are um, very adult. They're
Yeah.
very heavy. They have many implications, a lot of thoughtful and deep themes can come from them. And then of course there are some episodes that were just like, what do we even, like, this was just like a filler episode, what are we going to talk about? And
Right.
inevitably we'd find something, but it's pretty impressive that a show from the early 90s
Yeah.
was so formative for so many of us, and just could be so impactful and influence so many of the Batman fans out there.
Oh, absolutely. It is dynamite, and it was so interesting listening to your guys' podcast because I am behind on the podcast. I'm not caught up yet. So I'm at like, I think I'm at episode 54 right now. So I just finished up Mudslide, and because I found
Oh,
out about 5 months ago, like, so
yeah.
I'm trying to play catch up, and it's so unique because like I'm like, oh, when I finish this in a year and a half, I'll have to reconnect with you.
Well,
And
well, I would love that. We definitely need to kind of debrief and see, because it's a journey. I mean, it
yeah,
took us a few years. It did take us. I think we were upwards, well over 120 episodes maybe to get through, because we cover the original animated series and then the next iteration that took. There were a little bit of changes in the animation itself and
right.
also in the writing a little bit. So, the Adventures of Batman and Robin, the animated show that followed, so yeah, you've got a lot ahead of you,
I
and
do.
pace it out, I guess.
Well, it's funny because I have been going back in my head like, what episodes am I looking forward to, of like, I can't wait to hear what they're going to talk about. And one of them I haven't gotten to it yet because I'm like, I'm not skipping around. I can't wait to hear what you guys talk about with the episode with Baby Doll. um
Oh,
because I mean, for a TV show, it deals with a lot of stuff that like, and I'm just like, wow, like I'm intrigued. So there's so many. I'm just like reliving my childhood through this, and it's been a blast.
yeah. We really, we really enjoyed the. So there's a couple of episodes with Baby Doll.
Yeah,
Uh, it's very haunting. The story about her,
yeah,
her origin and all that. It's very, very, it's very deep, and the ending of that is not a typical ending for the animated series, but one that you see in
yeah.
some of the episodes. It does not sugarcoat it. It does not give you a happy ending.
No,
Sometimes there are individuals, characters, or situations that are tragic, and the writers did not try to create joy and what I'd say resolution for
right,
all of the episodes. And I think that's one of the episodes that stands out as, you know, her story is, for the most part, one that is a tragedy.
yeah,
And then we see her later and things get pretty bonkers. Like she and Killer Croc are a duo. And we did an entire sort of breakdown of like, what kind of relationship is this? And is it appropriate? And like all those things,
yeah,
she's an adult in the body of a child. He is a Killer Croc. How does this all
right,
um and but we have so much fun with it because we're saying the kinds of things that maybe other viewers are thinking, or maybe
right.
they want help processing it. So I want to assure people it can be intellectual at times, but it is not. We don't sit there and lecture you. We try to bring in theories around the mind, around like memory disorders, of course, mental health disorders and mental illness, and like recovery and resilience. How do we This is the time right now to better understand how do we deal with these tough times, how do we get through a crisis. And I think comics have always been there for us in terms of um of those highlights and those those moments of hope.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And how you guys present it, it is. I'm like, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to handle a whole psychology show of Batman, but like it is, you have a way of presenting it to someone who doesn't know that as much, and it helps through that process. And I think you guys both do such a great job of bringing that balance into the show. So
Thank
I've
you.
got to ask though, out of all the villains that you got to kind of look at on this series, what was one or two that were like, this was your favorite one to kind of like break down and talk about?
Heart of Ice is one of the episodes that stands out for me, and I know many people remember. Even if you weren't a fan of the show, you remember Heart of Ice, or you remember the animated version of Mr. Freeze. Like a lot of us of my generation remember this. This is, maybe another tragic story, but is giving us the opportunity to think in more nuanced ways and complex ways about people like Mr. Freeze, why they make decisions they make, why they might hurt other people, how something like his own personal trauma can kind of guide the formation of his sort of villain persona, and different ways in which actually he's not 100% bad. And so stories like that help me personally wrestle with issues around like behaviors are bad, actions can be bad, but does that make people bad?
Right.
And I work with college students. I used to work with children. I work with a lot of different folks, and I think that's kind of that's one of the biggest questions about humanity, especially right now. Um, how can we embrace people that are different? How can we embrace people who are not like us? And I think a second character, of course, is Batman, because he is giving us many examples of ways in which a hero can be vulnerable and fallible and make mistakes and have setbacks. And I like that. I think that that helps us learn about ourselves and um, our own doubts, our own imposter syndrome. This concept that like we're not going to be perfect, we're going to fall. And certainly that story of resilience is, how do we get up? How do we learn from getting up? And how do these experiences change us for the better?
Yeah, well, those are great picks.
Did you have, like, especially for the animated series, a villain or character that you were like, I connect to this person, or I love watching this person?
So yeah, I'm actually shooting a video on it right now. It's the Riddler for me.
I saw a lot of green there. I was like, it
Yep,
must be really
it's my
interesting.
it's one of my favorite characters in the Batman universe. What he just and those 3 episodes, because which is shocking that he's only in 3 episodes in the animated series, because it's so good. But the writing aspect that they do, where they take him through that process, and it seems like it's almost a continuation too of like from if you're so rich or if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? To what is reality episode of and I was just intrigued by that dynamic of the Riddler, um, and how he interacts with Batman, of this
Mhm.
kind of game of wits between, the world's greatest detective and someone who thinks they're smarter than the world's greatest detective. So, I, my favorite episodes, some of my favorite episodes were one of the Riddler episodes for sure.
Yeah, those are great. And you're right. It's hard to imagine any other character who is as tactful and strategic and brilliant. Bruce Wayne is these things, but the Riddler takes it to a level of challenge, like a level of like, let's be competitive. Like the Joker is a different, is a different contender, because the
Right.
Joker is all about chaos, and that's fun, but you don't get the sense of like that they're truly equals. I think the Riddler is a character that is probably an intellectual equal, and is like, how that's pretty menacing. Like for
Right.
someone like Bruce Wayne, that can be like, this person could actually take over the city.
Yep. Well, and I mean, you even see that in the, most of the episodes in Batman the Animated Series, they get caught and get locked up in Arkham. Like the first episode, he's like, you might have foiled my plans, but I'm already gone outside the city. Like you can't catch me."
Right.
So, like there is that, like they show that the smartness of him still too, of like, you might have beat me, but I still technically you didn't catch me. So you see that intellectual battle, and I think it's brilliant how they did
Yeah.
it. Um, well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I've got to ask. So, if someone that hasn't gotten to know yet, they're not familiar with your podcast or anything that you've done so far, but you are connected in the comic book world because you were written into a comic by the great Gail Simone in
Yeah.
Batgirl. You're Batgirl's psychologist. Like, how did that come about, and how sweet was that moment for you?
Totally indescribable. Not something that I ever would predict, and still cannot even understand now. It's kind of surreal. Uh, she had We had gotten to know each other through comic conventions, and just kind of like here and there we knew each other professionally, and she did ask me to advise her on a couple of aspects of the story that she was writing, which was a big deal. This was going to be, Batgirl emerging with in the New 52, right? A lot of retelling of her story and others, almost like this sort of reclaiming of her character, and a controversial decision that she would be recovering um, from her assault, from her trauma, and that would include psychological recovery as well as physical rehab. And what we talked about was what therapy would look like. And for this is psychosocial therapy, this is talk therapy, this is what would a psychologist say to someone who's experienced that kind of trauma? How would what, even the details to, like, what would that room look like? And what, is there a couch, is there a chair? Like some of the things I think all the questions people have about the nature of psychotherapy. And then we also talked about the character of Batgirl, who is looked at as such a resilient figure, and who's experienced this assault. One cannot deny that that has shaped her. So how are we going to show her be strong and independent, and yet be impacted by this assault? And so it was a really positive experience for me just to be a part of those conversations. Uh, and and I have to say, it was a small part of the bigger story that Gail was telling, that this was just really about the therapy. And then I was surprised to learn, literally like the day that it was published, that she wrote in a psychologist who would be shown, in the pages, who's treating Batgirl for her psychological trauma. Again, I can't even describe that feeling of, like, for one, this is what it's almost like this, like, circular, it's like synergy, right? The DC Comics brought me into the world of psychology and then welcomed me onto its pages in canon as the psychologist of Batgirl. Like the fact that I can even articulate that is bonkers. But that is sort of how I feel. It is not really about me personally. It becomes this big moment that comic books do matter. Those stories, like, I see you putting stuff together, like the relationship you have with the Riddler matters. The impact that these characters have on us matter so much. And it was so special that I could see that my profession, a psychologist, is on the pages, doing what they do for a character that's really essential to, the landscape of DC Comics. And I will forever be grateful that I had that opportunity.
It is so cool. Whenever I heard it on the podcast, I was like, I'm scouring comic book shops to get that first appearance, because I was like, it's just such a cool thing to have, and that was really neat.
Well, yeah. So I was going to say, if folks want to look for it, it is Batgirl number 16 and number 20 from the New 52 era.
Yep, that's so cool. And I'll even list it in the description of the video below so people can know, because I think it's a fun as they get to know you as a person here watching this interview. So as we're wrapping up, do you have anything else that you are you working on with podcasts or comic book world related stuff that you want to talk about?
Yes. Thank you so much for a time to plug. I would love it. Folks can go to fandom.com to find some of my essays that are all about the psychology of comic book heroes and pop culture heroes. So there you'll find some of the write-ups I did about Star Wars characters like Kylo Ren and Rey, some of the write-ups I've done on Marvel characters. I just did one on Black Widow that will be published hopefully by the time this is out. It'll probably be up. So again, if you go to Fandom, these are the folks that run the engineers, the engine behind the wikis, right? Fandom.
Yep.
You can also find them on my website, which is drdreapsychology.com. Just click on the link that takes you to the essays, and you'll find all of this stuff, which is like a fun thing to do. I just kind of got into, but I found that people have been thinking about these kinds of things, so it's well appreciated that people will read them.
That's awesome. So the podcast Arkham Sessions with Brian, like you said, you've done Batman the Animated Series, you've done Doom Patrol and you're doing Steven's Universe. Um, is this something you guys are just like, as long as we can keep coming up with ideas, we're going to keep doing a podcast?
Yeah, I think I don't know that we can quit this.
Yeah.
We just, and the I think Batman fans, like, we have a lot in common. We will. I mean, certainly will have a lot of material. That there'll be more stuff that we can talk about. But I do think that there's something really special about connecting with fans, and this podcast does that. So, whether we're working on series or films or anything like that, I know that there might be some upcoming opportunities to go back to the animated series. So that's kind of exciting. I
Right.
don't know if that's been really confirmed, but I know it's out there as a rumor. So yeah, I'm sure
It's
we'll be
it's a
continuing to.
rumor, but man, oh man, if they revisit that series, I'm there because they're doing it at least in comic book form right now, and it's one of my
Yeah,
favorite series. So
yeah.
that's great. Well, again, everything all the links that we've mentioned. What's the best way to people to follow you, social media or things like that, if they want to kind of know what's dropping?
Yeah. The best way to interact with me is through Twitter and Instagram at Arkham Asylum Doc is my account. And then certainly my website, that's where you can find a lot of my work, drdreapsychology.com.
Well, again, all the links that we just talked about are going to be in the description of this video. Thank you so much for just taking some time to talk about comics and Batman and just podcasting with me. Like, it's been a blast.
It's such a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully all you enjoy watching this interview. And as always, hopefully you can find some time to curl up, grab a book, and nerd out. Peace.